In April of 2026, while the United States Navy was consumed by a naval blockade of Iran, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and the aftermath of a war that killed Iran's supreme leader, something else was happening. 12,000 miles away, in the South China Sea, China installed a 352-meter floating barrier across the entrance to Scarborough Shoal. 10 Chinese Coast Guard vessels moved into position. Philippine fishermen were pushed out of waters their country legally owns under international law. The Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled a decade ago that this blockade violated the law of the sea. China did it anyway. The American response was muted, measured, predictable. Because America was looking at Iran, this is precedent. And today we are drawing the line on one of the oldest patterns in the history of great power competition. The pattern that says when a dominant power fixes its eyes on one threat, it loses the war it didn't see. Athens watched Sparta and lost everything in Sicily. Britain and France watched Hitler and lost China to Japan. Washington watched Berlin and woke up to Pearl Harbor. Now America is watching Tehran, and Beijing is moving. The history is consistent enough to be called a law, and the law does not care whether the people living through it recognize it while it is happening. In 415 BC, Athens was the preeminent military and naval power in the Mediterranean. She had survived nearly 2 decades of war with Sparta. She had built an empire of over 100 tributary cities. Her navy was unmatched. Her democracy was the admiration of the Greek world, and she was about to destroy herself. The Athenian general Alcibiades stood before the assembly and made the case for an invasion of Sicily, 1,500 miles across the Mediterranean, an island Athens had never fought on, against the city of Syracuse, which had never attacked her. The argument was that Sicily was rich, Syracuse was weak, and victory would give Athens control of the western Mediterranean. The skeptics pointed out that the war with Sparta was not over, that Athens had not yet destroyed her actual enemy, and that committing the fleet and the army to a distant theater would leave the home front exposed. The assembly voted for Sicily anyway. In the summer of 415 BC, Athens launched what Thucydides called the greatest action undertaken by any Greek city in his lifetime. Over 40,000 soldiers, more than 200 ships, the core of the Athenian military. For 2 years they besieged Syracuse. In 413 BC, the siege collapsed. The Athenian navy was destroyed in the harbor. The army attempted to retreat overland. The commanders, Nicias and Demosthenes, were captured and executed. Thousands of Athenian soldiers were enslaved in the Sicilian quarries, where most of them died of thirst and exhaustion. While the expedition was underway, Sparta did exactly what the skeptics had warned she would do. She exploited the distraction. She fortified the Attic countryside at the fortress of Deceleia, which sat permanently on Athenian territory and cut off Athens from her silver mines and her food supply. She rebuilt her navy with Persian gold. The Persians paid for Spartan ships on the explicit condition that those ships would be used against Athens. Within 9 years, Athens had surrendered. The walls came down. The democracy was overthrown. The empire was dissolved. The lesson is this: it was not Syracuse that defeated Athens. It was the fact that Athens was looking at Syracuse when she should have been watching Sparta. The threat you commit your attention to is not always the threat that will destroy you. And sometimes the real threat is not doing anything dramatic at all. Sometimes the real threat is just waiting for you to look the wrong direction. 2,346 years later, the pattern repeated itself on a continental scale. It was September of 1931. The League of Nations, the institution that had been built after the First World War to prevent exactly this kind of thing, was consumed with the problems of Europe. The Great Depression was in its second year. Germany was politically unstable and economically broken. France was building the Maginot Line. Britain was managing the decline of its empire and trying to hold the pound sterling together. The international order was real, codified, and backed by treaties, and it was about to fail its first major test. On the night of September 18, 1931, officers of Japan's Kwantung Army detonated a small explosive on a section of the South Manchurian Railway near Mukden. They blamed Chinese dissidents. The damage was so minor that a train passed over the tracks minutes later. But the pretext was enough. Within hours, the Kwantung Army had launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria, a region 4 times the size of Japan, with a population of 30 million and the natural resources Japan desperately needed. The international community responded exactly the way the Permanent Court of Arbitration responded to China in the South China Sea in 2016. They investigated, they condemned, they wrote reports. The League's Lytton Commission concluded in October of 1932 that Japan had been the aggressor and that Manchuria should be returned to Chinese sovereignty. The League General Assembly adopted the report in February of 1933. Japan's response was to walk out of the League of Nations and keep Manchuria. Nothing happened. Because Britain and France were watching Germany. Because the United States was consumed by the Depression. Because the Soviet Union was consolidating Stalin's power. Because the institutions designed to enforce the rules were simultaneously too distracted and too divided to enforce them. Japan understood this perfectly. It was the first test of the post-war order, and the post-war order failed the test in front of an audience of 30 million Manchurians and a watching world. The template Japan established in 1931 would be used again in 1937 in China, in 1940 in French Indochina, and in 1941 at Pearl Harbor. Each time the Japanese General Staff asked the same question, can we do this while the great powers are looking somewhere else? And each time, until it was too late, the answer was yes. By the fall of 1941, the United States was no longer a distracted power. She was a deliberately distracted power. Franklin Roosevelt had spent 2 years carefully turning American attention toward the Atlantic. The Lend-Lease program was sending billions in aid to Britain. American destroyers were escorting convoys halfway across the ocean. The USS Reuben James had been sunk by a German submarine in October, killing more than 100 Americans. Roosevelt was convinced, correctly, that Hitler was the strategic threat that mattered, and he was using every instrument of national attention to prepare the country for a war in Europe. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the intelligence was piling up. American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese diplomatic cipher, a program they called Magic, in the summer of 1940. They could read Tokyo's cables to its embassies in real time. By late November of 1941, American intelligence knew that Japanese carriers had left their home ports. They knew that Japanese diplomacy in Washington had broken down. They knew a major operation was imminent somewhere in the Pacific. The war warning of November 27th went out from the Navy Department to Pacific commanders in explicit language. The warnings were in the system, the analysts were writing them, but the national attention was pointed east toward Europe. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched 353 aircraft against the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 4 battleships were sunk. 4 more were damaged. Nearly 24 other ships were lost or disabled. Over 2,400 Americans were killed in under 2 hours. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. Within 6 months, Japan had taken the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and much of the South Pacific. The investigation afterward found what the investigation always finds in these cases. The warnings existed. They were in the system. They reached senior officials. The signal did not get through because attention was allocated elsewhere. The distracted power was not inattentive by accident. It was inattentive because its leadership had made a strategic choice about what mattered most. And that choice was correct about the larger war and catastrophically wrong about the nearer-term attack. Athens made that choice at Syracuse. Britain and France made that choice in Manchuria. Washington made that choice in the Pacific. In every case, the pattern is the same. The distraction is not a mistake. It is a decision. And then the decision meets reality. Which brings us back to Scarborough Shoal. As of April 2026, the United States is enforcing a naval blockade of Iran, with more than 10,000 personnel and over a dozen warships in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. The American political, military, and media attention is almost entirely consumed by Iran. The Supreme Court has forced the administration to rebuild its tariff regime. A Trump XE summit is 3 weeks away in Beijing. The Federal Reserve is meeting at the end of the month to reassess rates in the wake of the war. Every one of those is a legitimate claim on the attention of American leadership. And while all of that is happening, China has installed a 352-meter floating barrier across the entrance to a maritime feature that belongs to a nation the United States is treaty-bound to defend under the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. 10 Chinese Coast Guard ships are in position. Diplomats and analysts are openly stating that Beijing is exploiting the fact that Washington is distracted. The 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration said what China is doing is illegal. The ruling does not matter, because enforcing it would require the United States to commit attention and resources to a second theater, and the United States has neither to spare right now. Beijing understands this exactly the way Sparta understood it in 415 BC, the same way the Kwantung Army understood it in 1931, the same way Tokyo understood it in 1941. A dominant power that is looking the other direction is not the same thing as an absent power, but for the period in which it is looking the other direction, the practical difference is small. The question is not whether China is making a move. China is already making the move. The question is the same question the distracted power always faces at the moment of decision. Is the thing we are looking at worth what we will lose while we are looking at it? Athens did not think so when she voted for Sicily. Britain and France did not think so when they chose the German problem over the Asian one. Roosevelt did not think so when he chose the Atlantic over the Pacific. Each of them believed they were managing priorities correctly. Each of them was wrong in a specific and devastating way. History does not tell us whether America is making the same mistake right now. It tells us that the pattern of great power distraction is so consistent and its consequences are so severe that the burden of proof should rest on anyone claiming this time is different. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sets a precedent.